Hi guys! In this video we're going to be exploring the relationship between fractions, decimals and percentages. Now, put quite simply, decimals and fractions and percentages all do the same thing. They are all different ways of showing a number that is less than a whole. Now, we should already be familiar with how numbers are constructed. So we have whole numbers, which are this side of the decimal point here, and then we have numbers that are less than a whole, which are this side of the decimal point. The larger numbers move up to the left-hand side, and the further right we go, the smaller and smaller the numbers get. Now, a clue to the relationship between fractions, decimals and percentages comes from the names of each of these place values. So we know that these are called hundreds, we know that these are called tens, and we know that these are called units. These smaller components to the right-hand side of the decimal point, they have quite a telling name though. They are called tenths and hundredths. So, where have we seen these terms before? Tenths and hundredths. The answer is fractions. If we take a whole number and we split it into 10 parts, we have a tenth. If we take a whole number and split it into 100 parts, we have a hundredth. So these terms are already familiar, and already we're starting to get a clue as to how decimals and fractions are related to each other. So, looking at some examples, we're initially just going to work at changing decimals into fractions using this knowledge. So, if I take a simple decimal, let's say 0.3, what I'm saying I have here is no units and 3 tenths. Well, we already know how to write 3 tenths as a fraction. Basically does what it says on the tin. 3 tenths. 3 over 10. A nice easy example. If I took 0.7, it would be 7 tenths. Again, nice and easy. Where things maybe get a little bit more challenging is where we have fractions that could be simplified. If I take 0.2, that would be 2 tenths. And if I want to show off, I could simplify this because I recognize that 2 and 10 are both in the 2 times table. So if I divide them by 2, I get 1/5. If I take 0.5, that is 5 tenths, which again I could simplify by dividing them both by 5. So 5 divided by 5 is 1, 10 divided by 5 is 2. So 0.5 is the same as a half. Now, what if we take other decimal numbers where we have hundredths in it as well? So if we take 0.73, well, what we would get there is not tenths, but hundredths, because we've not just used the tenths column, we've used the hundredths column as well. So this would be 73 hundredths. So 73 hundredths there. And as before, the same sorts of rules can apply when it comes to simplifying. If I have 0.25, this can be written as 25 hundredths. But I could simplify this. So I could just use my 25 times table, divide both of them by 25, but if that was too challenging, what I could do is I could break it up into steps. How many 5s are in 25? 5 of them. How many 5s are in 100? 20 of them. Then I just simplify it again, dividing by 5 one more time. How many 5s are in 5? 1. How many 5s are in 20? 4. So we realize that 0.25 is the same as a quarter. So we're seeing how to convert decimals into fractions. So what about percentages? Well, percentages are just fancy fractions. A percentage is any fraction that is out of 100. So it is the same as 100. So for instance, if I take 25%, which we've done already, we did that one as the last example, that would be 25 hundredths, which again could be simplified to become a quarter. We can see this even clearer when we actually highlight 25% of this 100 square here. So we can see that 25 of these have been coloured in, and that is the same as a quarter of the full shape. So 25% is a quarter. Now, written as a decimal, as we know already, this would just be 0.25. Now in this case, we can see that 50% of this 100 square has been coloured in now. Using our knowledge of fractions, we can tell that that is 50 hundredths of the square that's been coloured in. To simplify it, I could divide both of these by 10. I would get 5 tenths. Now that can be made a little bit simpler still by dividing both of these by 5, because they're both in the 5 times table. And what we get is a half. Now this makes perfect sense. If we look at the entirety of this shape, we should recognise pretty quickly that we have coloured in half of the shape. Half of the shape is orange, the other half is white. So 50% is the same as a half. Now, to change this into a decimal, I could write it as 0.50. But zeros at the end of the decimal number don't matter. So I can leave off the last zero, and it's just 0.5. So 50% is a half as a fraction, or 0.5 as a decimal. What about just 10% then? So 10% is 10 hundredths, and that can be simplified by dividing both of them by 10 into a tenth. So 10% is the same as a tenth, and written as a decimal, it would just be 0.1. 1/10 in the tenths column. Now, there are some percentages that when they're written as fractions can't be simplified. So if I take 37% here, as a fraction, that would just stay 37 hundredths, because there is no times table that has 37 and 100 in it, and so it can't be simplified. Similarly, written as a decimal, it would just be 0.37. So we should now see how we can change percentages into fractions and decimals. Where this gets tricky is when we have to turn fractions into decimals or percentages. Now, if we're talking about a fraction that's over 100 already, so if we're talking about hundreds, this can be quite easy. If I'm given 50 hundredths, well, that is 0.5 or 50%. No big deal there. But there's some fractions that are a bit more challenging. So if I take a quarter, this is not over 100 here. This is over 4. And so straight away, I can't just write this as a decimal or percentage. However, I can kind of do the opposite of simplifying. I can unsimplify this to make the denominator 100. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to times this by 25. I times the bottom number by 25, and I times the top number by 25, because I know that 4 times 25 makes 100. So what I get now is a bottom number that's 100 and a top number that is 25, which means that we have 0.25 as our decimal, and 25% as our percentage. If I have 3/4, I could do exactly the same thing. I times them both by 25, and I get 175. So 75 hundredths, 0.75, or 75%. Now, it's a little easier when it comes to tenths. For writing that as a decimal, it's really easy because it's already tenths. So I've got 0 units, but 3/10. To turn it into percentages though, I'll need to get the denominator to be 100. How do I turn 10 into 100? By timesing it by 10. So I times the bottom number by 10, and I times the top number by 10. What I end up with after doing that is 30 over 100, which is 30%. So we've now seen how to convert decimals into fractions and percentages, how to convert percentages into fractions and decimals, and finally, how to convert fractions into decimals or percentages. And the key for that is to make sure that the bottom number, the denominator, is over 100.